a little record. I think it's going. Yeah.
Okay, hold on a sec.
Ooh. Welcome to the show, everybody.
Thanks for being here.
This is my friend Ben. I don't know if I'm actually going to show this to students or not. It depends on how it goes, but if I do end up showing this to you guys, this is my friend Ben. I've known him for a very long time. He currently lives in Portland, Oregon. That's all you need to know about him. That's his cat in the background, I believe.
Oh, yeah.
He's good at music and rollerblading tricks. We're going to talk about, in this video, the rebellion chapter of the Brothers Karamazov. And maybe next time, if this goes well, we'll try the Grand Inquisitor for you. So, as you guys know, I've read it a bazillion times. I love this book. I think it's the best book ever written. I think these 2 chapters are the best chapters and the best book ever written. My friend Ben here has never read any of this before. And I sort of gave him an assignment yesterday, I guess, and he did it, as you guys should do. Without question, he just did it. So what are your first thoughts on reading Rebellion?
The sort of level of intensity, and for me, knowing you and having a collective appreciation for music, this was like way more lyrical and musical than I imagined. And I don't mean that it was like flowery in the text, because obviously it's not. But for me, a musical quality is something that can ramp up in either intensity or complexity, mm-hmm. and then continue to go beyond your expectations. So this hit a level of intensity for me about halfway through, mm-hmm. where I was like, okay, like this is a lot.
And so then you can feel like Ivan's energy building up, like as he gets more and more excited to like a crescendo.
Totally.
Okay.
And especially the very last passage, like an example of some of my favorite music is when you're completely convinced that the piece is finished, yeah. And it absolutely punctuates it beyond your expectation. And the last paragraph is completely like mic drop, right. Just like it demolishes it.
So like builds, crescendo.
Yeah.
Sort of calms down a little bit and you're like, okay, this is going to be like a normal narrative progression.
Right. I can tolerate it.
Oh, wait a minute.
Yeah.
We're not over here yet. There's something else. That's what the Grand Inquisitor is, except that second peak will be higher.
Oh, good.
Right? As a good song should do.
Right.
Blow your load.
My emotional state can handle that right now.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning, right?
Okay.
What was the first thing that you noted as being noteworthy in your notes?
Okay. Well, like the first concept isn't so far from us, right? Like it wasn't a big leap. There's this kind of question of like, it's not individual liberty, but sort of like familial liberty, right? Like we're content to sort of like love our children more than we are allowed to say, love those that are distinct from us in whatever ways we've decided, societally, let's say.
People view children in a special way. And that's important to what Ivan's talking about.
For sure. I would say that there's a theme before that, though, which is like, okay, the thing I highlighted was, for anyone to love a man, he must be hidden. For as soon as he shows his face, love is gone.
Okay.
So
great quote.
Was this like, does this suggest something about vanity? Or something about like sort of like shallow, like that love is kind of hindered upon like what we see on sort of a surface level?
Yeah, I think because when you know someone at a surface level, you see like 10% of them and 90% what you project onto them as being.
Sure.
So you see them as like vague archetype.
Yeah.
So you'd see like a beggar as beggar archetype without any details.
Right.
Child archetype without any details. And it seems like he's saying that it's easier to love an abstract idea of somebody. But once you actually get to know them and all the warts start to show,
Yeah.
it becomes far more difficult. So you'd be better off if you wanted charity to do it through the newspaper in an unknown form, right?
Right.
Okay.
That there's almost a benevolence in that shallow love, right? Because it doesn't meet any resistance. The sort of like, I love you abstractly because I don't have to face down the like the challenges that come with close proximity, actual connection. Sort of like, I love you enough to like, you know, loan you a cup of sugar or bring your mail to you if I see it, like, you know, as I'm approaching your door. You know, sort of like,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. So I think I think you could probably push Dostoevsky's thinking here all the way to like the limits of his central thesis, which is sort of it's easy to want a Christian ideal because he's like an obvious Christian.
Yeah.
But the trouble is when the rubber meets the road and you actually meet your neighbor, you don't like your neighbor. So there's this contradiction going on.
Mm-hmm.
You want to love all your neighbors, even your enemies. And that's easy to play around with as an abstract thought. As soon as you meet people, people annoy you. Little things that they do, the way they look at you, the way they breathe too loudly, the way they chew, little things gnaw away at you and bring up this internal urge to not love, to hate almost, to be disgusted by, repulsed by. But that's all he's saying here, I think, is that that's always there, right? Now, he's bringing that up for some sort of reason. So we have to figure out why that is and why he uses children after having said all of that.
Right.
Right. So why does he use children? Why did you think he said that?
Well, one thing
I don't want to move ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
One thing before we get there is I think kind of the counterpoint that he brings up here as well, when he says, and what's more, a man is rarely ready to admit another's suffering, and then in parentheses, as though it were a distinction. And what I think he's saying here is like, if you're under the impression that your suffering is distinct from mine, you're under an illusion, because the likelihood that that suffering will enter my life is a certitude. I thought that was an interesting counterpoint to, like, you know, this sort of force of repulsion, right? To identify the other, to go, oh, I don't like my neighbor because he does this or that, or thank goodness I'm not suffering like my neighbor with cancer, or thank goodness I'm not suffering like my neighbor with his ailing wife. Like that notion that source of tragedy, you know, won't befall you, is an illusion that one would be foolish to hold on to.
I like that too. Okay, I like that.
So the next point he begins to go on is, I guess, introducing this notion of what distinguishes the child from the adult, right? Those who've eaten the apple and those who haven't.
Right. Now, that's crucially important, right?
Yeah.
For one reason, it brings up the apple and the loss of innocence theme, which of course will always be an undercurrent here.
Yeah, I was surprised by the amount of allusions to, like, Catcher in the Rye theme that were just littered through here.
You know me.
Right.
You know the type of thinking I'm interested in.
Sure.
This is right up my alley, right?
100%.
As I think it is yours. Okay, so everything that he said about his neighbors does not hold true for children. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. So Ivan, now not Dostoevsky, Ivan is choosing to use the people who you can't possibly hate, right, to make his point.
Right.
and then we can go on from there. So we're gonna, I guess, summarize a little bit as we analyze.
Right. I mean, I think he kind of wraps it up in "I fancy though children never are ugly," right? Which is sort of he's like he throws that casually in parentheses in the middle of the argument, kind of like, yeah, try this on for size. You know, try to argue your way out of this, and it's like, okay.
So he's gonna get rid of all the ugly people,
right?
People who are worthy of hatred and contempt. Let's ignore them for now. Let's just focus on the good ones, right? Just the kids, the ones who you can't possibly hate.
Yeah.
It's going to strengthen his argument in a certain way. Although he says it reduces its power in terms of numbers, it makes up for it in like pure emotionality.
Yeah.
Right? For like pure pathos. So, okay, keep going. What do you find interesting next?
Well, one question I sort of had as I was reading it was the way that he likened the Karamazovs among like people he was hoping to argue against, let's say, and observe cruel people, the violent, the rapacious. The Karamazovs are sometimes very fond of children. Like he lumps themselves right alongside these sort of, repugnant individuals.
Yeah. Okay, so he's one of these people who have eaten the apple.
Yeah.
Right? Okay. Keep on going. Oh, sorry. The only reason I would say not to possibly pursue this is that it might not make sense if you haven't read the rest of the book.
Right. Yeah. That was one of those sort of like without context that produced a little bit of curiosity to me because.
And you're right to have that red flag be raised because it is important, but let's keep going because I don't think it'll make any sense.
Got it. Well, then this was when the level of severity of the text became clear to me with the nailing the ear example.
Yeah.
Because it was like, okay, this guy's content to take this argument all the way to the wall, right?
Yep.
You know, to go beyond. Like the first threshold that he kind of destroys here is this distinction of like, bestial cruelty, right? And it's like, no, don't be fooled that bestial cruelty is the hard stop. The cruelty of man exceeds this,
right?
Like in myriad ways.
Yeah, this isn't like an animal killing another animal,
right?
Out of hunger or anger or something like. This is meticulous, pre-planned.
Yeah.
Torture that results in like a sadistic sense of joy,
right?
In human that is impossible for other creatures, right? So there's another wall there that you didn't think might be there. All right, okay, so keep going.
Well, there's also a sort of like writing mechanism that starts to become apparent to me here too, which is that like the sort of like the conversational mechanism is like, I'm going to push you till you're sick, and then I'm going to remind you that this is a conversation like, brother, what are you driving at? Or like, you're not quite yourself right now, but wait, there's more.
And
which
then
I just
the next level.
Yeah.
It goes like, you feel terrible. Pause for a second. No, it gets worse.
A little intermission. It's like, you got drinks, you got popcorn, stick around.
So for anyone who is watching who might have forgotten how the plot of this is set up, Ivan is discussing to his brother Alyosha at this point a series of real incidents that Dostoevsky took from newspapers at the time of basically children being tortured in various ways, to various extents. And as Ben just alluded to, it seems like each story gets a little bit more extreme. And Ivan checks in with Alyosha and you, the reader, to be like, are you following along? Are you seeing what I'm doing with each example? How I'm pushing this further? Okay, so keep going.
Well, another threshold quote here. I think if the devil doesn't exist, but man has created him, he has created him in his own image and likeness.
What's the God create a man in his likeness around on its head, right? Yeah. Now, crucially important, this is something that we've probably talked about, but remember, people who will be watching this are like 17, 18,
Right.
right? So imagine you're that age, you come across this. You haven't thought these sort of thoughts before. Why is that quote meaningful? Why is it significant?
For me, I would say the notion of like a devil-like figure is very much like outside in as a younger person, right? These were sort of like, these were obvious rules to avoid, to distinguish oneself from. And this idea here, I think, is positing under no illusion should you see this as other than, you know, these are all, it's the Solzhenitsyn quote, you know, the dividing line between good and evil runs down the center of every human heart.
Exactly. So there's a little devil inside of you.
Right. Which, from my sort of cursory understanding of the Russian guys, I mean, this is one of the pivotal thematic things, that it's like, it's all here and it's all in you. And to try to identify evil as outside and not of potential in you is one of the sort of like barriers of entry in tolerating this material.
Yep.
Sort of like, you've got to be willing to tolerate it. You know, you've got to be willing to accept the notion that you're the Turks in this circumstance.
Right.
Like,
there we go.
Yeah.
For those of you, the Turks are some of the people doing the torturing in one of the little mini stories that Ivan tells Alyosha. Do you remember what they do in particular? Is that the one with the gun, the soldiers?
Yeah, that's the bayonets with the babies, torturing the babies, and shooting the babies point blank.
After they like grab the gun and giggle.
Yes.
Right. Ooh, that part gets me every time.
Yeah, that I was. Yeah.
Yeah. And he's oh, keep going. Sorry.
I was gonna say he also tries to broaden this a little bit by saying that there's sort of like, you know, everyone has their sort of fashion of this, the sort of like identity politic of this, when he says nailing ears is unthinkable for us, for we after all are Europeans, but the rod and the scourge we've always have, and they can't take them from us. You know, like we've got our own, we have our own t-shirt version of this.
That's another wall that he busts through, right?
Yeah.
Like as he's, you could argue, upping the amount of suffering. Although that particular thing with the Turks and the gun and the baby, that one gets me maybe the most out of all the stories.
Right.
But I feel like he's trying to make them more extreme every time. But he also brings it closer to his original readership, right? Like, so he's like, okay, here's an example of foreigners and the type of stuff they do. And he knows enough people listening, Ivan, or reading Dostoevsky, would probably be like, okay, there's evil in the world, but that's other people. That's a different. We don't do things like that. Our culture is more civilized than that. But then he continuously brings it closer to the Russian soul, to something that they would be like, oh damn, that's me.
Yeah.
Right. So he is doing what I think you were just saying is like a core tenet of the Russian writer's sort of agenda to some extent, which is to show there's an evil part in all of us that for some reason, and I think this is where this gets deep. Like up until that point, you're like, yeah, okay, obviously, like kindergartners have seen like the picture in a cartoon of like a guy with an angel and devil on his shoulder. They get that the devil's there, that voice is there. But why is it important to know that and to think about it? That's what I think one major theme Dostoevsky pushes at is, why is it good to be conscious of that?
Right.
Because it seems to run contrary to the Eden story, which is that more consciousness leads to suffering, loss of innocence and suffering. But he seems to paradoxically be making the argument that you should know about this evil because not doing it is dangerous in some way.
Right.
So how do you reconcile those two things? I mean, we can get there. I don't know.
Yeah.
That's a whole bunch of gibberish. I don't know.
No, it's not. I think the thing that it points to is the attempt to make this unimpeachable too, because like as you were talking, I was thinking that like, yeah, if this were an illness, the like different types of evil, like it to weed out one of them is sort of like treating the symptom, whereas expecting the notion that this is like that this stuff is endogenous, that this
Like
stuff
the
is
branch of a tree, but
yeah,
the trunk and the roots are some archetypal evil.
right.
Okay, and these are but manifestations of
Yeah, and to go, oh, we chopped off that branch, like we're good now. We've
yeah,
just got the like white European style evils, and those we like because we're white Europeans.
yeah, okay. So what was the next point?
Let's see. Then they go into the analogy of the child that's raised in as a sort of like farmhand, and then is eventually welcomed by the church as he finds grace. I'm trying to think of. Yeah, I mean, I think he kind of uses that as an example and wraps it up in every man, of course, a demon lies hidden, the demon of rage, a demon of lustful heat at the screams of the tortured victim, the demon of lawlessness let off the chain, the demon of diseases that follow us on vice, gout, kidney disease, and so on.
It seems to be a variation of that same theme.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a personification of what came before.
Okay, so he's establishing this point through repetition, through pushing through different boundaries every time, crossing different thresholds that brings it closer to the Russian soul and also to Alyosha. Maybe we should start to talk about him a bit, right? Because this is not, the framing of this is interesting. It's not Dostoevsky philosophizing. It's Dostoevsky talking through a character, Ivan, who is Dostoevsky in part, but where it ends up is Ivan is actually everything Dostoevsky doesn't believe. The thoughts that he has and has had that he rejects. Alyosha is sort of what Dostoevsky would like to be, but maybe isn't quite capable of. This makes sense. So
yeah,
Ivan might be closer to the real him, but he's, to use a modern term, steel manning,
right,
the counter argument, right? So this is all getting closer to Alyosha, right? Why is Ivan telling all of this to his younger brother? Because that's why this isn't just philosophy. It fits within the dramatic framework of the narrative too.
Yeah.
Right? So why would this brother, who's clearly cosmopolitan, intellectual, be telling his younger brother Alyosha, for those of you who forgot, or I don't know if we've talked about this, Alyosha he's a monk in training. He's young, he's pure, he's innocent, but he's good. Ivan's smarter than Alyosha. Alyosha is arguably better. He's like the soul, he's the heart, Ivan's the brain, and these two things are in conflict. Why is the brain telling the heart all of these stories of torture and suffering? Right? What do you think he's building up to with all of this? Go ahead. I want just your first impression. What do you think's going on here?
Well, I mean, I was struck a little bit by the first sort of introduction of personality for Alyosha at the end of this passage, where he's like, never mind, I want to suffer too, which is sort of like, there's something there that's about like the nobility of suffering, or that somehow that it's like, for me, an example of this when I was younger was like, I assumed that all things that were healthy to eat had to taste bad, right? Like I assumed the peak of like a healthy diet was just like eating raw broccoli all the time, which is
the bitter medicine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is me projecting a little bit, but I see it seems like you can see some sort of like there's something kind of naive in that desire that like suffering leads to more suffering equals more truth or something.
Ooh,
Yeah.
right. Because if you look at it like an equation, right?
Mm-hmm.
To go back to the Eden story, the more you know, the more you suffer. So probably the inverse of that would be possibly, this might be true. The more you suffer, the more likely it is that you're onto something true,
Yes.
right? If truth leads to suffering, probably
Right.
suffering leads to truth. I'm not saying that's a true equation, but it
Yeah.
seems like people might operate thinking that that is true. And maybe
Yeah.
Alyosha is doing that, right? Because he's sort of like, I don't like that. You get the sense he doesn't want to hear this, but he does.
Yep.
I need to hear it. I must suffer too.
Yeah.
Like these children, kind of, right? I want to suffer like them.
Yep.
Um, but I don't have the text in front of me. I think he was also talking about Ivan seeming like he was suffering at the time too with these thoughts. And he
Yes.
wanted to suffer along with him in thinking them through.
I think that's a fair
Does that
assessment.
seem true, having just read it?
Yes, it does.
Okay. So Ivan just continues, right?
Right. Then we move into the death of an innocent child,
Right.
which is like the sort of next wager that he begins to like place in the text, right? Which he doesn't punctuate until just about the very end, but he starts sewing it in here.
Yeah.
And he uses the example of the surf boy hurting the wealthy sort of like diplomat's dog. And this leading up to him being slaughtered by a pack of dogs, basically in front of his mother.
Right.
Um,
Now, is there something about, there's some reason why Dostoevsky chose that? That's the last little mini story he tells, right, Ivan?
yeah, basically.
If I remember correctly.
Yeah, it is.
So one thing that you might want to do, dear listener, is try to figure out why in a situation like this, the author would think this is the most powerful of those mini stories, right? Because to me, the Turks with the gun at the innocent baby who giggles because he's so innocent, then grabs the gun as if it's a toy or something before getting shot, like that, I almost cry every time just thinking about it. But Dostoevsky seems like he thinks, we can infer, that this is worse. Why would this be worse? Because is it worse? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, he puts a few sort of like he dresses this one up a little bit with some issues of class, right?
Yeah.
Some issues of like demonstrable distinction. Like he says that he has like 2,000 people on staff, right?
Right.
And makes them watch, makes his mother watch, uses such a primitive tool, right? The dog.
Right. Almost in this cruel like reversal because
Correct.
the kid injured a dog, so he had a bunch of dogs who didn't know what they were doing
Right.
attack the innocent. I think there's, if you read enough Dostoevsky, he doesn't tell stories without seeing, he doesn't have his characters tell stories without seeing a metaphor. The fact that the dogs are also innocent, but are the ones who end up doing the actual harm, I think Dostoevsky chooses Ivan to choose to say this one last. Because I think in Ivan's mind, that's the way the world is set up. That God must be the master who has the dogs, the ignorant, attack the innocent. Right? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Like, if you go as negative as you can possibly go, which Ivan is doing.
Oh, you just fucked me up. Excuse me. Sorry. We'll bleep that one in post.
Fix in post. Sorry, children. Does that make sense?
It makes complete sense. And I was thinking as you were talking about how like if I were to feeling like I were in the process of writing this text, it feels like every sentence was labored over with unbelievable
Yeah.
like making it unimpeachable.
Right.
And the question that that is imbued in what you're describing here is basically like if we are to so the diplomat guy is inexcusable
Mhm.
here, right?
Yes.
So how possibly can a god be excusable?
Yes, exactly that. Like the Lord of this land
Yeah,
story is obviously, not obviously, but potentially analogous to the Lord of all the land, which would
right.
be a God figure. And
Yeah,
it's about as bad as you can get.
right.
But you can tell, again, dear listener, I'm not saying I believe this. I'm not saying Dostoevsky seems to believe the opposite of this, but he's making the strongest case possible for Ivan's side. But Ivan seems to believe that that's what the world is. The ignorant attack the innocent suffer, the ignorant have no clue what they've done. Um, and if God knows all of that stuff and either created a situation that set that in motion or sees it and allows it to exist without intervening, that he is the Lord of the manor there in that story that Ivan tells.
Yeah,
Well, that's as dark a place as you can get, right?
yeah. That's
Because,
that's the strange loop
yeah,
all of a sudden, right? Because it's like um, the sort of hierarchy of intelligence is always based on like the highest present level of intelligence in the circumstance, man.
mm-hmm.
But if also implicit in um, Christianity is the notion that like man is subservient to God.
Yeah,
You know
you
what?
scale it up.
Right.
Yeah,
How is that any? How does that produce any distinction, really, between who's holding the leash?
right. Okay, and this is where Dostoevsky and Ivan are brilliant because it's tough to poke a hole in that logic, right?
Yep.
And this is why I think that story leads right into the question that Ivan asks Alyosha, which makes up like the end of the chapter. Do
Yeah.
you recall what the question is? If you
Um,
have it in front of you?
like uh, whether or not it's worth like the suffering of one is worth the
Right.
creation of all, which is basically like whether or not being is worthwhile.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So he frames it, this is going off memory once again, but he points it right at Alyosha's heart because Alyosha is like the heart of this family,
Yeah.
right? Just a reminder for anybody, this family has three main brothers, a fourth sort of brother who you don't need to worry about, but the three are Alyosha, who's like the heart or soul, Ivan, who's the brain, the intellect, and Dmitri, who is like physical pleasure, impulsivity, hedonism, that sort of stuff. So he doesn't factor into this at all. Ivan knows that to convince Alyosha of whatever he's trying to convince him of, that he needs to go for the heart because that's where that's where he lives and that's where he'll be moved. Um, so after telling this sequence of terrible stories, he ends with this question. He says, Alyosha, if you were the creator of all existence and you knew that in order for there to be a sort of ultimate paradise that everybody ends up in at some point, could you be the architect of that universe if it meant for sure that one baby who the Turks killed would have to die? Could you create that situation if that were the only way, even if it did lead to paradise for all later on? And he says, no, I wouldn't consent. Like Alyosha, the religious soul of man, says, no, I myself could not do that, because that would be sort of like being the Lord who knew that the dogs would eat that kid alive, even though he didn't eat the kid alive himself. He set that in motion. So could you be God, Alyosha? And he says, no, I couldn't. I disagree with God's ethics, right? He's backed this guy into a corner. Does that make sense? Like, how do you what's the workaround? How do you wiggle your way out of that if you're Alyosha or anybody?
Right. Well, let's scale back a little bit in this section, because I think he takes some really fascinating, well, this is the way that I took it.
Yeah.
He takes some fascinating shots at like what effectively becomes like new age philosophy.
Oh, he does. Like, I forgot about all this. Okay, yeah.
When he's like, let's see. With my pitiful earthly Euclidean understanding, all I know is that there is suffering and that there are none guilty. That cause follows effect simply and directly. That everything flows and finds its level, but that's only Euclidean nonsense. To me, that is like modern day, like it is what it is. Just like find your bliss.
Right.
It's totally like
he just shuts it down in like a sentence.
Oh my God. With none of like contemporary language or all of the things that we now treat religiously without any religious connotation, be it like crystals, Reiki healing,
right.
whatever.
Like a vague spiritualism.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Well said.
That's a good. He takes so many turns here, Ivan. You're right. In every turn on the path, he sort of knocks something else out. Like, well, maybe you could lean into spiritualism, all of this being true about all these kids suffering.
Right.
Maybe you could get really into crystals and like, like floating down the river, merrily, 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 life is but a dream. Like, let's just go with the flow.
Yeah.
And no, no, that's not an option.
Right. No, you can't be
worth really worrying about or talking about at length, but it's not an option. Sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah. No, I mean, just the notion that like the passivity is somehow benevolent, right? That like just by being sort of more casual about the tragedy of life, or the sort of scale of tragedy of life, that somehow you can be removed, that you can avoid it. It's like, no, you are in this equation.
Yeah.
Inextricably.
Yeah, it will affect you. You can't just sit back and it won't affect you. I mean, as clearly we can see right now, we're recording this during like Corona Scare 2020, right? Like the world will come.
Yeah.
You can't escape it by pretending it's not there, in other words, and just going along. Yeah. So anyway,
totally.
Go ahead.
And look at what a leveling factor too. Like, money can't buy food on empty shelves or toilet paper.
That's too.
Yeah. And I love the way that he weaves in the problem and the obligation of forgiveness in this, which is like the heaviest thing, especially
who could forgive this sort of thing, right?
Right. And who should?
Right. Who has the right to forgive that?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. As if the like one's individuality within a tragedy, like questioning whether or not that gives you priority and forgiveness.
Right.
Right. That if an act is so tragic that like that it's unforgivable on any playing field, it basically destroys like identity.
Yeah, so let's explore that a little bit, because I'm recalling now where Ivan goes with this a little bit, right? And he brings up one of the children and talks about his mom, I think.
Yeah.
And is like, well, can she forgive? And Ivan's like, well, she can forgive for herself, but not for the kid. Like, she doesn't have a right to forgive on behalf of the kid because she's not the kid.
Right.
So who has the right to forgive any of this? Because if you don't have the right to forgive it, how can you forgive your neighbor, going all the way back to the beginning? Right?
Yeah.
Cycling this back. He's clearly going to do a little Jesus smuggling, to use that phrase, right?
Yeah.
In his way, but that'll come later through Alyosha, right?
Shout out Doug Murray.
All right, so we could talk about that for a while, but I feel like we would get ahead of ourselves and perhaps spoil the Grand Inquisitor to some extent.
Okay.
Because I feel like he answers that question of who has a right to forgive,
Okay.
but not in the cliche possibly way that you might be thinking of right now. Like, it's not like a Jesus. No, it's a lot deeper than that. Obviously,
Right.
it's Fyodor. So let's keep going. What else did you find interesting? This little build up to the question, or we could talk about the question, Alyosha's response, or
I think there's at least one more thing worth mentioning, and especially tying back to this notion of how this text feels musical to me, is that he plants the notion of harmony right here at the end, right? As sort of this like shimmering bell-like tone, right? This thing that all of this is justified for, right? To me, this also called into question lots of Eastern mysticism, right? Like the bell being, so kind of this, extending tone of like neutrality,
right?
Which he's not willing to bend on.
No.
Let me find this. But what pulls me up here is that I can't accept the harmony, and while I am on earth, I make haste to take my own measures. You see, Alyosha, perhaps it really may happen that if I live to that moment or rise again to see it, I too perhaps may cry aloud with the rest, looking at the mother embracing the child's torturer. Thou art just, O Lord. But I don't want to cry aloud then. While there is still time, I hasten to protect myself, and so I renounce the higher harmony altogether. It's not worth the tears of that one tortured child who beat itself on the breast with its little fist and prayed in its stinking outhouse with its unexpiated tears to dear kind God. It's not worth it, because those tears are unatoned for. They must be atoned for, or there can be no harmony. But how? How are you going to atone for them? Is it possible? By their being avenged? Well, what do I care for avenging them? What do I care for being avenged? Or what do I care for a hell for oppressors? What good can hell do, since those children have already been tortured? And what becomes of harmony if there is hell? I want to forgive. I want to embrace. I don't want more suffering. And if the suffering of children go to swell the sum of sufferings, which was necessary to pay for truth, then I protest that truth is not worth such a price. I don't want the mother to embrace the oppressor who threw her son to the dogs. She dare not forgive him. Let her forgive him for herself. If she will, let her forgive the torturer for the immeasurable suffering of her mother's heart. But the suffering of her tortured child she has no right to forgive. She dare not forgive the torturer, even if the child were to forgive him. And if that is so, if they dare not forgive, what becomes of harmony? Is there in the whole world a being who would have the right to forgive and could forgive? I don't want harmony. For the love of humanity, I don't want it.
Damn. And he goes on. This is what he's talking about, returning the ticket to at some point.
Yeah.
Like, this is the mindset of a guy who has thought all this through to the end and has concluded that existence is unjustifiable.
Right.
Like the rules of the game that have been set up that we're all playing are unjust rules. So he'd rather end the game. It's not worth the harmony later on, and also because that you could say that's a value judgment.
Right.
Ivan takes it a step further and says it's not even possible for the harmony to ever come about, because I'm glad he brought up that bell earlier on, because he talked about the cries of the child sort of ringing out, which would be a discord in that harmony.
Of course.
The cries of the child, they never go like the eternal bell. They're always part of the song of the Om, to use like the Indian term, right?
Totally.
But there's no way there's no note you could play that could harmonize with that because it's such an evil intrinsically, right? So he attacks it emotionally, he attacks it judgmentally, right? Like, I think I'd prefer non-existence to existence with these rules. But then he takes it a step further. Logically, you couldn't even have the higher harmony because of the discord earlier on, right? Okay, so and I know I just repeated myself, but for anyone who maybe needed to hear that again, including myself, because I'm working this out as well.
It bears repeating.
Yeah.
And I think it actually comes back at a Christian philosophy of the sort of distance between heaven and hell, right? That somehow this higher pitch, this higher harmony is justified by virtue of its distinction from this, that somehow the chimes, the bells of heaven ring clear and true because you can't hear the bowels of hell.
Right.
But the question he's positing here is like these bells can't ring over this.
Right.
The notion that like somehow harmony is achieved.
They both exist. You can't have one without the other. You can't have your rose without your thorn, right? Yeah. To go back to our old poem from a long time ago. Ivan would prefer it's just this, just neutral, nothingness, void, right? So he is a true nihilist, an active nihilist, right? Not someone who does not have something to believe in and therefore believes in nothing, but someone who actively believes in nothing, right? Like you could almost call him like an annihilist, right? Like he wants to annihilate all things, to make something nothing, because nothing is preferable to a something that implies necessarily that heaven's not justified if there's a hell. Maybe would be a way to condense it down. And it's an argument, right? It's a tough one, and Dostoevsky gives us a little clue about, of course, where this is going, but it's in a sneaky way, because you see, it's not simple. Ivan's baiting Alyosha. He knows he's setting Alyosha up when he asks him, well, who could possibly be justified in forgiving all of this, right? He's saying, Alyosha, say it. Say Jesus. Say it. Say it. Because that's what the Grand Inquisitor is. He has this whole story concocted in his brain about Jesus coming back to Earth during the Spanish Inquisition, and about how that would play out. We'll get to that in the next video. But he wants to tell that story. So he really is baiting Alyosha to say Christ. Just say Christ. Say it.
You.
And then I think we already talked about the ultimate question he asked Alyosha, which is, well, could you build this exact situation? No, right? So he has Alyosha on the intellectual ropes, so to speak, and Ivan, in trying to act like he's better, right? Like he's above suffering. He's definitely taking a joy in making Alyosha suffer. And it seems like they have a sadomasochistic relationship where Alyosha wants to suffer. Ivan, without perhaps knowing it, is trying to get Alyosha to this breaking point. Because it's like it's a test for Ivan. If I can break down Alyosha, I'm right. But only if I can break down Alyosha. I have to beat him. Because this is their family, right? And one thing we talked about in class, but I don't think we've talked about, is, but you could have surmised from what we said earlier, that the family itself, you could just see it as different aspects of the human psyche, right? And the mind in Ivan wants to be the dominant figure. The intellect wants to be the dominant aspect of the human experience. But in order to do that, it needs to subjugate the emotions, because the intellect oftentimes can get overpowered by emotions. As anyone who's ever been a human being can tell you, when you're emotional, you don't think clearly, right? So this is This is the big boss battle. This is brain versus heart. He has him up against the ropes. He's already had Alyosha denouncing his own religion to some extent, or at least, I mean, what could be more blasphemous for a Christian than to say you disagree with God's overall plan, like his mission, not one little detail. The entire mission
Right.
is fucked from the beginning. Sorry. That's the most blasphemous thing someone can say, right?
Yeah.
And then he's
Well,
like,
as someone who's devout, right? Like, which I'm just realizing now. I'm picturing Alyosha in the boardroom with Jesus, right? And like, it's more blasphemous to be in the boardroom and be like, boss, I think your plan, like, it doesn't check out, rather than like, you know what, I'm kind of a casual fan, Jesus. And
Right.
like, I like some of your early stuff, but like the later stuff is garbage. Like that's somehow less blasphemous than being close to the circle of trust with the big man and being like, actually the closer I get to the core of this thing, the more I'm like not into it.
Right. Oh, by the way, I should also mention, the driving, this will tie back to what you were just saying, the driving premise of the plot of this book is their father gets murdered.
Oh, good.
And which brother kills the father is the murder mystery, right? So right now, you could see how perhaps that ties into what Ivan's doing, which is essentially trying to kill God.
Yeah.
But like actively acknowledge that he's there and say that he's wrong and kill him that way. Not just to say he does not exist, to say he exists and is wrong, therefore must disappear. Right? So that's throughout the book, that's a possibility. Ivan maybe wanted to kill his dad for some of those reasons, that he's mad that he was brought into existence, right?
Yep.
Amongst other things.
Yeah.
So you can see how that parallels the philosophy of the conversation.
Totally.
The narrative structure of the book. So I actually think, do you have any closing thoughts, perhaps? Because I think
have a couple. Yeah. Well, for one, I'd like to just read this last passage.
Okay.
Because the thing that I think is really important about it is that it, like, there's a certain like teenage nihilist that I think is present in Ivan,
mm-hmm.
that he really sums up in the end, where he expresses he doesn't become anti-human, he doesn't become he doesn't deny his humanity. He wants
pro-human, anti-God. Because he's pro-human, he's anti-God, right? Yeah.
So that's rebellion, murmured Alyosha, looking down. Rebellion? I'm sorry you call it that, Ivan says earnestly. One can hardly live in rebellion, and I want to live. Tell me yourself, I challenge your answer. Imagine that you are creating a fabric of human destiny with the object of making men happy in the end, giving them peace and rest at last, but that it was essential and inevitable to torture to death only one tiny creature, that baby beating its breast with its fist, for instance, and to found that edifice on its unavenged tears. Would you consent to be the architect on those conditions? Tell me, and tell the truth. No, I wouldn't consent, said Alyosha softly. Yeah. It brings into question every single distinction that relies on the suffering of some to justify something else later. Yep. I see this across personal fronts. I see this across class and societal fronts, and economic fronts, of course.
Like an ends justify the means argument.
Yeah.
And he's saying that that's not okay. The ends do not justify the means. Yeah.
And the way that he's using such a singular, like, he's taking it to its logical conclusion. Like, would you do it for just one tortured life? Yeah. Just one tortured soul for everybody else?
But it's the opposite of how it's easier to love people in the abstract. When it's a child, you only sympathize when it's a single child. For some reason, that's more powerful than a million children. Because a million children that's a statistic.
Yeah.
One child is a human being, and you're like, oh, could I do it to this one kid?
Right.
It's different somehow.
Well, because the world exists, consciousness exists in individual notion. That the scale of consciousness is always divisible to the level of the individual, right?
Yeah.
Like that's as big as anything else. And it also suggests the Pareto principle too, right? Which is that the kind of inverse of that, you know, that just for one, you know, that the cost is only one for everybody else's. It's like, no, that doesn't check out that way either.
Right. So I would say, maybe to end this, and the segue into next time with the Grand Inquisitor, which I love Rebellion. The Grand Inquisitor is better. like like that after you read Rebellion and just hearing you talk about and hearing some of the passages is like reading it again.
Yeah.
Like for the first time almost. I can't imagine something being more airtight than that.
Yeah.
Right? But it adds this narrative frame of a poem that Ivan composes in his head that he then recites to Alyosha. And the poem is a metaphor to try to checkmate Alyosha. Right? Because it approaches it in a different way. Because, of course, he's baiting Alyosha to bring up Christ. So he talked about God. Now he's going to checkmate Christ as to why Christ is bad. Think about that. No one's made that argument before. Like you can say, people have said, many people think he's not God, but he's good, right? Like good guy, peace, love your enemy. That's good stuff. He might not be God, but that's good. He's going to make the argument that he's actually, and this is Ivan, not Dostoevsky. Remember, Dostoevsky sides with Alyosha, that he's bad, and it will be nearly as airtight as this argument is. And yet, in the end, Alyosha wins without saying a word. Kids, I've mentioned this to you before. He doesn't say a word to Ivan, but he wins the argument. Ivan, this whole sort of through line that he begins at the beginning of Rebellion and ends at the end of the Grand Inquisitor, this strong argument, is correct logically, but it's wrong on some level. And you can sort of feel that you're like, I don't want to be him. There's something about that I don't like. And we're going to see Alyosha's response will prove how he's right, even though he's incorrect, and how Ivan is correct but wrong. How those two things interact with each other to some extent. So we'll get to that as soon as we can. I want to thank Ben, everybody. Say bye to Ben and say thank you for all of his help. And we'll catch you next time. We'll stop recording now. Somehow, I'm old.
Bye, guys.
Oh, I hit the stop button. That's how you do it.